Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture Albion Never Dies, the podcast and YouTube channel that asks the question, what is Britishness? Now, the reason I ask this is, of course, I spent most of my life outside the UK. As I've talked about elsewhere on this channel, I spent 7 years in Turkish Cyprus, I worked in Saudi Arabia and Oman, and I spent 6 years in mainland China. Right now, I am actually in Kuwait. I realise the background may look very similar. I'd go outside and record this video just to prove it. However, it is 50 degrees Celsius outside. That's 123 degrees Fahrenheit. So I think I'm good recording in the air conditioning. I thought I'd talk a bit about what it's like to live abroad and work abroad. It is different from being on holiday. When you go on holiday, beautiful place, beautiful people, everyone's friendly. Of course they are. You're throwing money at them. Everyone enjoys a really good holiday. When you settle in to live in a foreign country, whether it's China, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Saudi Arabia, they're all very, very different. There are several distinct stages that most people go through in terms of their emotional state, in terms of how they relate to the other. Now, of course, that's very important for this channel because it's my experience with the other and other people often asking me about British culture that led to me to start to question my culture, explain my culture, and get an interest in, okay, what is Britishness? Had I lived in the UK, I might not be asking these questions because it would just be around me and I'd take it for granted. Now I feel I have to study it. But as I say, that first move, going to live abroad, there are, let's say, 5 distinct stages, and this is something that's been written about by quite a lot of academics. The first stage is known as the honeymoon stage, and that really is just like a holiday. You go to a new place and you feel it's different, it's exciting, it's interesting. You start to take in all the sights that you can. This is going to be your busiest time, as of course you have to find your place to live unless you're working for a company that gives you housing. You're going to have to find your new supermarket, your new corner shop, and you have that thrill of discovery. Honeymoon is the stage where I have the least to say because there's very few problems associated with it. The second stage is popularly known as denial. Denial is where you've been having such a great time, it starts to wear off. You start to feel perhaps a little bit bad, but you kind of push that away and you're like, no, I'm incredibly lucky to have this experience working abroad. I'm not going to acknowledge it. I'm not going to deal with it. This stage can be long or short for different people in different environments. Most people start to have their false winter. They realize that this isn't a holiday. They start to miss friends and family. You don't necessarily miss them the first 2 weeks, perhaps even the first month. But after a few months, you start to realize, oh, it has been a long time since I've seen so-and-so. And maybe I do miss so-and-so at my normal corner shop. And this shop never has the thing that I really want. It starts to build, but most people put it to the back of their mind, and you start to get that build-up of frustration. The third stage is anger. Anger comes when you can no longer ignore the problems that are around you. Every country has problems. Every country does things a little bit differently, and some of those ways you might not actually like. I have had somebody say to me, but surely if you go abroad, you just accept everything over there, and that would be a wonderful thing if we could all just manage to do that. However, most of us do have ways that we like. We have our own personal preferences. A lot of them are built in and cultural, and as we live abroad, we start to notice them more and more. Again, things that we might take for granted, we can no longer take for granted. They're right in front of us. There are ways of doing things abroad that we will not like. And it's not always a simple matter of accepting. So what can you do? This may seem dark and depressing. Well, for me, one of the best things to do is in the earlier stages, in the honeymoon stage, and maybe even the denial stage, you start to save up those little bits of home. Whether it's your favorite chocolate bar, so for example, Americans come to the UK, notice we have really different chocolates as on the European continent, and certainly traveling further afield, we find that the sweets are very different. So collecting up the sweets, collecting up the particular tea brand, collecting up whatever you need. When I was living in China, I had a Chinese friend who had lived in the UK for almost a decade. She particularly missed British crisps. You could get crisps in China, but she just missed the British ones. She lived there long enough, and so when I had a trip back home, she asked me to basically stuff my suitcase full of Walker's crisps. It's what she wanted, so I did it. But you can always save up these little things. It could be like a podcast you listen to, it could be a radio show, a movie, whatever. But just so that you can have one of those reset days at home. And of course, in this day and age, we have Skype, we have Zoom, we have a variety of video calling software. Checking in with somebody back home fairly regularly can be a wonderful, wonderful thing. Escape is the fourth stage. Escape is where you've had your at-home days, you've had your kind of trying to work through things, and maybe you've just decided, okay, it's 8 months into my contract and I just want to go. Escape is normally the lowest point. Maybe you've had some personal tragedy. Maybe there's been a tragedy back home that you're having to deal with remotely. All kinds of things go on, life goes on, and you are removed from your normal means and ways of support. For me, the best thing to do for escape, yes, a call back home, yes, a day at home, but also try and recapture some of that initial honeymoon vibe. That piece of advice may apply to many areas of life. So one thing you can do, and one thing a very good friend of mine did do, is in China, my friend would go to a different metro stop every weekend. And maybe they'd go there, there's nothing, they go back. Cool. Then you save it for the next weekend, you go to one, oh, there's an interesting coffee shop. Oh, there's an interesting park. Or something like that. Or just an interesting little residential area you can walk around. Just normal streets, but it means that you keep on discovering. For me, it was really going to the cities around the Chinese city that I was living in because I found them just so interesting. I was dealing with Mandarin Chinese in my day-to-day, and as I travelled around, I dealt with more Cantonese, and I just found that really, really interesting if I went on a trip. So escape, you can escape locally, you can escape through your phone, you can escape through films, but also building that local support network. You're very rarely the first person from your country going to a specific country. So I wasn't the first Brit in China. There was a bit of a British community, actually especially close to Hong Kong. That was very nice. In Saudi Arabia, there were expat communities that I could join, and those were vital. So building your local network, just like back home, you have your support network, you can build one abroad. The final stage, the dream stage, is maturity. Not everybody reaches it, but when you are in another country and you've come to accept their ways, some of their ways you might quite like, whether it's the coffee, whether it's the snacks, whether it's their way of doing business. I think this is the most satisfying stage. It's the one where you're at the same emotional level as perhaps before you left, or maybe even a nicer one. Presumably there's a reason you left. Hopefully it was just wanderlust, but some people are moving abroad because there's some unhappiness they want to get away from. Of course, they'll be taking themselves with them, but hopefully there's something in the new environment that does some good. So maturity is the stage where you're very much at peace with the place where you are living. And maybe even when you go back home, you'll find that a bit of a struggle. In fact, in the description to this video, I have my first year back in the UK podcast episode. That was about half an hour, much of it actually recorded in China, talking about what my day-to-day life was like in China, and then at the end comparing it to my new life in the UK. It can be very difficult to adjust back and can involve many of the same stages. All throughout these stages, do try and build some kind of support network, allies, friends, acquaintances, just even having the same guy at the corner shop who always knows what you want. That can be a wonderful thing. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that you found it in some way interesting and possibly helpful.